we have known the background of the Native American writing, and there is a new writer who was born in 1966, our own time, and I think he is still alive and kicking, because he is asserting himself against the pressures that he has to bear from the population of the whites, and it's a mixed population, but then and there, of course, I think somewhere you would also touch upon the other victims of the white American race in America, because there are blacks, and those blacks may also have struck an understanding with the Native Americans, if at all. I'm just raising the question out of curiosity. And also that in the 19th century there were writers who were as much critical of Christianity as Alexie is. There's Nathaniel Hawthorne, there's Whitman, and they talk about nature and about the relationship between man and nature and all those things. And Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter is one example, going entirely against Puritans and exposing their cruelty and their cynicism. So these questions emerge just out of curiosity under the argument that you presented in the first lecture. So now once again over to you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Prakash. So Alexie actually has written one of the poems on equating the lives of the Native Americans with the Jews, and this poem actually talks about the game between the Indians and the Jews. So where he talks about the kind of genocide that happened in the 20th century with at Auschwitz, for instance, he equates it with his own sort of people's genocide that occurred systematically in the previous centuries. And there he says that he's obviously referring to the Jew as his brother, and he says that you and I will continue, we have survived. We are the people, we are the children of the survivors. So, and we will continue to survive, and this is what unites us. So, I think he unites with the Jews of the world and with this kind of extermination that happened there, and he equates that kind of genocide with what happened to the Native Americans in the previous centuries. And he also takes a dig at Christopher Columbus, for instance, for he says you were the first real estate agent because you sold the myth and the land, and the myth of the land to these people who then came in and settled. And so in a way there is a kind of an irony in this entire celebratory tone that he takes in the poem. So I think he equates his kind of suffering with the people who have survived violence, and he sees his own race as the race of survivors. So I think that's where he finds the connection, not so much with the black people, but definitely with the Jews, that he finds that kind of connection. But he's talking about this unique identity of the Native American people, and he also desists from giving you, for instance, a sense of, and he says, I don't want a Native American in a loincloth. He says that's your projection, or that's a myth that you have been parceling, but that's not the Native American. He also wants to bring the Native American, he also wants to talk about the Native Americans who are now urbans, who have now been absorbed in this society. He says people like himself, that is, they are people who are urban Indians, who are no more, who are a part of the larger culture, and yet their identity is distinct. So he tries to go into the layers of this experience while still talking about an identity that can be formulated of people of the native Indian descent. But I think what he wants to, the place where they unite is the area of survival, and that they have been incorporated in this world of the white people, and they have been absorbed by it. And then even when there is protest and all of that in his poetry, he's not somebody who shows that kind of hatred, but certainly there is this sense of protest in his works. In fact, at one place Alexie noted, and I quote, he says, many people have been reading literary fiction for the same reason they read mainstream fiction, that is, for entertainment and as a form of escape. I don't want to write books that provide people with that. I want books that challenge, anger, and possibly offend, unquote. So that's the kind of model that he has before him in writing, that he wants to challenge these preconceived notions.
He is, I think, socially very aware.
Yes.
If there are inequalities and injustice, then why should one remain complacent
Right.
and ignore these things?
Right. Also, because being a part, because he talks about poverty a lot, you know, in his poems also, he builds that poverty. So, coming from a culture where he has seen, where he has felt so insecure in among wealthy white people that, you know, he felt a moment of crisis and got into this addiction. So tells you about this kind of life that these people had, the poor people had in America. For the poor, the American dream did not exist, and it does not exist even in this kind of contemporary society. So with this, and with this rampant American corporations taking over everything, he also hits back at this kind of corporate culture. In fact, you know, let me give you a sense of his the poverty that I'm talking about, and maybe this poem, which is a very simple poem. You know, I wanted to take out another variety. Poems which are not on reservation and all of those are very stark, hard-hitting sort of poetry. The other variety in his poetry that you find in his collection, you would find very emotional, deeply emotional poems, you know, where he's a self-conscious person and he's trying to struggle with his own position in, for instance, in a family, you know, or within the family, what's his relationship with his father, with his mother. So these are very emotional sort of poems that you find in his works. And one of these poems which deal with the question of poverty, as I was suggesting, I'd like to read that. He says, and I quote, "When I was 12, I shoplifted a pair of basketball shoes. We could not afford them otherwise. But when I tied them on, I found that I couldn't hit a shot. When the ball clanked off the rim, I felt only guilt, guilt, guilt. Oh, immoral shoes. Oh, kicks made of paranoia and rue. Distraught but unwilling to get caught or confess, I threw those cursed Nikes into the river and hoped that was good enough for God. I played that season in supermarket tennis shoes that felt the same as playing in bare feet. Oh, torn skin, oh, bloody heels and toes. Oh, twisted ankles, oh, blisters the size of dimes and quarters. Finally, I couldn't take the pain anymore. I told my father what I had done. He wasn't angry. He wept out of shame. Then he cradled and rocked me and called me his little basketball Jesus."
He is very rich, you know, metaphorically speaking. He
Yes.
sustains the metaphor till the end.
Till the end.
Yes,
And the
sir.
narrative goes on. Even in
Yes.
poetry, there is no weak point. Everything is so crisp and chiseled. Each phrase is so chiseled in the sense that the metaphor strikes, you know, as intense.
And I think discipline comes from his experience, from his pain,
Right.
which is long and which is not going to disappear even later.
Right, right.
So metaphor is under pressure.
Yes, absolutely. And he deliberately puts it under pressure because he wants it to remain you know, exist in that crystallized form. He doesn't like to expend. He's actually somebody who's very impatient with a lot of sentences. So he says that, you know, I like to see it in its very sharp existence without the clutter.
That is what poetry should be.
Yeah, right. So in a way he said, and you know, the whole idea of pain, of poetry, of pain and poverty, you know, that how living in these power, and the question which is moral, immoral, you know, stealing, and then stealing and a sense of guilt of wearing those shoes and not being able to hit one shot because, you know, they are not bought, but rather they are stolen. So the whole idea of morality and you know, I find it also very interesting when one looked at what he said in, say, Crow Testament. Very different sort of a thing, because there he's hitting out.
He's evolving as
Right.
a poet.
Here he's talking about how a culture which he doesn't like or disapproves of, even that culture has entered his own being. You know, how he has absorbed those ideas of Christianity again when he says, my father called me this little basketball Jesus. He says, and he said, he told me that every cry of pain was part of the hoop sonata. Then I laughed and bandaged my wounds. My Indian boy, poverty, basketball, stigmata. That's how he ends.
How it involves the whole thing.
That the
Weaves
Indian
a pattern
boy,
out of
right? The Indian boy, poverty, basketball. Those are the kind of things that would define a Native American. That this is what my life was. I was poor. I wanted those shoes. I wanted to play well, but I could not. And if I stole them, then I felt guilty.
And aesthetically, linguistically, it's a very tight poem.
Yes, that's what I wanted you to. And this is a personal case. It's not like talking about testament or the community. It's a personal journey of this boy. He's written this very interesting memoir also, about his life, which charts his early adolescent years, growing up in these kind of strains. So I wanted to give you a sense of this kind of poetry of poverty. But to talk about the American corporate life and culture that he talks about, there's a poem which is titled Evolution, and it's from the collection The Business of Fancy Dancing. Again, one of his early collections, 1992, where he talks about an evolution in itself tells you how the Native Americans have evolved, right? Again, there is pun there. He's deeply satirical in this, and let me quote a thing. Basically, let me quote it first, and then we'll have a discussion. So, in the poem begins with Buffalo Bill takes everything the Indians have to offer. Now, Buffalo Bill was in his own, in the 19th century, he was this American soldier who, who hunted and who was a great, hunter, and could capture that buffalo, one of those varieties, and so he's known as to be, this American. He's the icon of this American cowboy culture in the region. So he's using Buffalo Bill as a sort of a kind of a metaphor here for that this kind of boisterous sort of American who managed to tame the Native American, so to speak, right? So now this Buffalo Bill, again reference to this avatar of American capitalism now. So Buffalo Bill in the 20th century, the 19th century American soldier who was this great soldier according to Americans, he says now this Buffalo Bill has taken a new avatar in the 20th century and has become this kind of an icon of American capitalism and corporate culture in society, and he has opened a pawn shop next to a liquor shop, and where he takes anything and everything from the Native Americans that they have, because they are addicted to, you see, there is a reason why the pawn shop is next to the liquor store, because they are all addicted to alcohol, and because of this addiction they tend to sell everything that they have, and he takes them. So there is he has opened a pawn shop, this capitalist American, and now near a liquor shop where these Native Americans tend to give everything they have. So, in the poem,
it's a double exploitation.
Double exploitation, yes. There'll be a triple exploitation. Let me come to that. So, let me quote. Now, Buffalo Bill, this figure then, takes everything the Indians have to offer, keeps it all catalogued and filed in a storage room. The Indians pawn their hands, saving the thumbs for last. They pawn their skeletons, falling endlessly from the skin. And when the last Indian has pawned everything but his heart, Buffalo Bill takes that for $20.
Just see the kind of violence that has been brought in.
Yes. This sheer sort of violence, and then how it turns into this kind of a kind of derision, I would say. Then what he does next is he closes up the pawn shop, paints a new sign over the old.
Remarkable.
Calls his venture the Museum of Native American Cultures. Charges the Indians $5 a head to enter.
That's what he meant by triple kind of exploitation.
Yes, exploitation. So, one, you have shoved them in colonies, that is the reservation colonies, where you have taken away their sustenance, their livelihood, their sense of identity too, and given them some food rations, etc. maybe. But beyond that, what has the American people done to these Native Americans? They have made them useless. And being useless, they've turned them into good for nothing people who and opened for them and given them access to alcohol. Right, given them access to these liquor shops, and then making them sell, pawn all their stuff and driven them to this kind of addiction, so that they are completely lost. So the first battle what that happened probably was a physical battle where the warheads met, but this kind of complete I would say destruction or a systematic you could say killing of these people through the new mode, that is through alcoholism, by not giving them any sort of means of sustaining themselves
And
or evolving.
See the presence of blood, bones,
Right.
all those things. It's a very stark poem.
Yes, and then also turning them into museum pieces. Turning them and now making a museum for them. It is highly ironic that there is actually a museum of the Native American people that is there in New York, and there are several such museums of Native American cultures. In fact, one is reminded of these, there are these tourisms that happen even in India where they show you tribal villages. If you go towards the Andamans, you actually have tour of the tribal people's villages as if they were museum pieces and who are stuck in a time warp, and you're just showing around, look what civilization, look how far we've come. So in a way he is hitting out at this culture, the American capitalist culture, that has created a kind of completely useless entity out of these people. In another poem of his, Alexie says that, what do I want from this country? And he says that, what do I want from this country? We are just waiting to turn into museum pieces. So you can already see this kind of hard-hitting sort of metaphor that he builds around Buffalo Bill, for instance, the crow in the other poem, or museums that are meant to now harbor them as if they were an extinct sort of people, right, who have no, and they've been marginalized to such an extent that the revival is almost impossible. So I think this is something which is very strongly present in a lot of Sherman Alexie's works.
From the aesthetic angle, I find that initially he was making statements,
Right.
and now he started showing things as they are,
Right.
and it's a kind of concentration of detail, so that the final meaning is completely communicated to the reader.
Right.
Earlier he was just telling them, now he's showing them.
Right. So in his personal poems, he's more into showing, and the narrative builds up. But when you turn to these ideological sort of positions that he's taking in these poetry, and when he's very angry with this culture, that's when he turns these into metaphors and uses them, would use them in different ways in the poems, and which is why they become hard hitting, and the whole talking about the evolution then, from that moment to when they were hunters and gatherers to this point where they have become museum pieces for American cultures to look at, right? And then charging Indians $5 to enter, because, and and when he goes into this, he goes into the list, basically the section that I've not read from the poem, he goes into this list of things that they have taken 12 years to, for instance, make a fabric. Now they gave it to the pawn shop. So their handicrafts, the things that constituted their identity, all those things they have now become inaccessible to their own people. So language, people, oral history, myths, songs, all of them are on the verge of extinction. So there is a past that has rapidly dissolved in this kind of a consumerist culture, and a future which looks towards a sort of extinction, because they are few and far in
And
between.
the way you present, there is a kind of journey that starts from the 19th century, and it moves inexorably towards capitalism, and where whether it's you are a white or a black or a Native American, all of you become some kind of playthings in the hands of capitalism.
Right. And that is true. But he takes this journey even further back to Columbus's first adventure, and he says that should we celebrate your 500 years in this country, what about those before, what about the years before that? So he takes one juncture in one important juncture, and then takes the leap from there. So for instance, he would stop at 1492 and then come to the present time, take the Buffalo Bill incident or in the 1850s, and then bring to the 20th century. So he takes these leaps because what he's trying to say in these poems is that there is a longish history that Native Americans have. That history is not when the American settlers came in. the history of this land is the history of
Much
the Native
older.
American people who have lived for centuries in this land for thousands of years. Not the history did not begin 500 years back when Christopher Columbus first landed and discovered India.
Yes,
So in a
yes.
way he wants to create a parallel idea of history of this region and in a way reclaim America that was known to them. And not the America that is parceled by the white
This
people.
is a fine point. Can you talk a little more about this?
See, what I mean by saying this is that, Alexie uses songs and myths as strong indicators of the Native American culture. And in doing that, he also posits this, there is black humor, but there is also a sense of lyricism when he's talking about it, because these constitute a sense of, it's about the roots of the Native American people. It's about their mythology, their storytelling. And at one point he says, the Native American people are actually androgynous people. We don't have the very stark binaries of masculine and feminine. We are, in fact, the masculine people wear vibrant clothes. They are the ones who are, we are really androgynous people. What he's doing is he's talking about a history of this land that is not the sort of the sole right of the white people. That this land and these people are, it belongs to us. We have a history. And this history goes even further beyond and before the when the white settlers came in.
Does the woman appear in his poetry?
Yes, as wife, as mother. So he's written a very interesting poem around his wife and as a family. What is it? Again, personal poem, but dealing with his own self-conscious or questions related to the self. When he talks about his mother, for instance.
And there's no gender prejudice.
Not really. In fact, he says that in fact there is a sense of celebration because I think they are so close to the to nature. They seem to, in fact, he says we are androgynous people because we grew up in matriarchies. He says our culture, our native tribes were all matriarchy. We grew up in matriarchy, so we, in a way, men are have the feminine side in them, and they are androgynous people because we grew up in matriarchy. So in one of the poems,
and women are strong.
Women are strong, but also he seems to celebrate. He says, for instance, I remember this one phrase from his poem. He says that he's talking about his child being breastfed by the mother, and he says there is something when the mother shines in the dark. She is the star in the dark, because it is that kind of a beautiful relationship between the mother and the child is something, he says, that is completely unavailable to the man. And he's talking about this kind of, the stars, and he talks about his own self, his relationship with his child. He says, but what my wife has with my child is completely different. So there is a celebration of motherhood and a sense of life, that is the woman who's the life giver. So, and that I think gets related to the Native American celebration of nature itself. So women in fact have a higher position, have a higher place in fact than men in his worldview and picture. So that's how I look at his work.
Please sum up the entire argument from the beginning, when Native Americans were done to death and destruction, to when they came up and they started evolving, as citizens of the modern world.
Right. Well, that's a tall task, I would say, but still, what I wanted to do through this lecture, or to give through this discussion today, was to tell you how Native American writers today are retelling the Native Indian people's struggle for survival, and by painting this kind of, at one level, a painful portrait of their lives, but also a vibrant portrait of their lives, of modern, and also bringing into being then the modern American Indian predicament, wherein capitalism has taken over everything. Corporations have come in a very big way. They are surrounded, their people are now surrounded by disease, poverty and addiction. And what is the way forward then for such people is what Sherman Alexie is trying to find through his works, and he's a pacifist, as he says in many of his works. He doesn't believe in these wars, but I think there is a sense of there is a sense of deep-seated pain there, which, for instance, he does that in his novel Reservation Blues. It is replete with these black humor instances, but then talks about the Native American traditions also. So I think he's trying to bring out the Native American traditions, but also deal with this kind of pain which they feel is very difficult to manage, which was the pain of their people in the 19th century when they were displaced, but the pain of contemporary people also who are unable to cope with this kind of lethal onslaught of profit making, etc. That is inherent in American culture. So they have to deal with these two very strong influences: one, being displaced and preserving their Native American identity, but two, also putting up a fight against this kind of culture and build a counterculture, so to speak, I think.
So friends, we have turned a page, which in American history shows us new things, and there is a whole culture that was initially devastated, and it was not known till the other day. And maybe in the early 20th century, people woke up to the presence of the Native American culture, and finally, the people have realized that there was a vibrant system, as Dr. Bajaj has pointed out, and that is sought to be now renewed and reinterpreted in terms of poetry, in terms of fiction, in terms of statement that we have in literature. So I think it's a very enriching lecture for us, and in fact I wish that Dr. Bajaj also takes up some other writer from the same tradition to add to this very valuable information regarding literature and regarding academic studies. Thank you.